Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler episode 488. Today the Amateur Traveler talks about historic wooden churches, colorful gravestones, and the agricultural heritage of Northern Romania. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Without further ado, let's talk about Romania. I'd like to welcome back to the show Ralph Velasco from photoenrichment.com, Photo Enrichment Programs. Ralph has come to talk to us this time about Romania or some destinations in Romania. Ralph, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Chris, great to be back.
And you didn't hear it, but we just referenced last week the show that we did on Montenegro, but we've done a few different shows together. You didn't hear it because it isn't out yet at the time that we're recording this.
Right.
So where in Romania are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk about two regions of Romania that are in the northern part of the country. One is called Maramureş, and the other is Bukovina.
Okay. And why would one go to Maramureş and Bukovina?
They're just fascinating parts of the world. These regions actually sort of flow into southern Ukraine as well.
Mm-hmm.
So not just specific to Romania, but we're going to talk about just the Romanian parts. But this area is like just taking a step back in time. The people there are still living in ways that are very interesting. It wasn't a part of the world that I had much knowledge of before I went about a year ago to scout it out for a photo tour that I just led a couple weeks ago. But in my research and planning, I just thought that it was an extremely interesting part of the world and a place that I wanted to bring a group back to.
And can we put it on the map in Romania?
Yeah, they're in the northern part of the country.
So north of Transylvania?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
There are two regions in the northern part of the country. And Maramureş is sort of the northwest and Bukovina is northeast.
Okay.
Excellent. And what kind of itinerary would you recommend for these regions?
We spent about 8 or 9 days just in this part of the country. We did include other parts, Bucharest and Transylvania, on the entire trip, but we're just going to talk about these regions today. We flew from Bucharest to a town called Cluj. It's about an hour flight, and that just kind of saved us a lot of time instead of driving with a group. So we flew and drove a few hours to a town called Budești. This is, it's a fairly small village, but there are some nice hotels there. It's an absolutely gorgeous part of Romania, if not the world. Rolling hills, beautiful agricultural lands. The time of year that we were there, which was September, first 2 weeks of September, was sort of the second harvest of the hay fields.
Okay.
So when I was there scouting a year ago, we were there these same 2 weeks. So let's just call it the first 2 weeks of September. And when I was going to bring the group back this year, 2015, we were talking about doing it in October, the actual trip. And in talking to my guide and tour operator, he said, the hay harvest only lasts a short window of time, and it's probably not going to be happening in October. And so I said, well, then we absolutely have to move the trip to the same first 2 weeks of September. So like I said, it's the second harvest because in June, so sort of late spring, is the first harvest.
Okay.
Now, last year they had a fairly wet summer, so the harvest was wonderful in September. This year they had a pretty dry, hot summer, so that window of time was shifted a little bit. So we didn't see quite as much of the hay harvest, which was a real highlight this year.
Okay. Now, I'm curious. Ralph, as we've talked about before, runs photo tours, and that's what you were talking about in terms of the scouting out the trip when you went there the first time. But you run trips all over the world. So what drew you to Northern Romania in the first place? Why did you think that this would be a good place to even do a scouting trip?
Initially, we were approached by the tour operator, and this often happens. So they find out where we lead trips to, see that we don't go to Romania, and say, hey, have you ever considered coming to our country? We get that a lot.
I'm assuming you turn a lot of those down, though, too.
Yeah.
So they sent you some piece of information or some photo or whatever that got your attention.
Absolutely. So what I was going to say is that we get that a lot. And then, for the ones that do have any kind of interest, we'll start to dig deeper and ask for the tour operator to send us a suggested itinerary. Of course, we'll do a lot of research online. The tour operator will send us some pictures. We'll talk to them, Skype with them. And so going back and forth, we determine whether or not this would make a great trip. My overall criteria for a great trip is variety. If I could put it in one word, is, does the destination offer variety? And by that, I'm certainly thinking of photo opportunities, but also for my trips, which I call more cultural tours than photo tours, is what's the food like, the people, is there agriculture, what are the photo opportunities, is there plains and mountains, so what's the variety? Can we experience a lot of different things in the same location?
Okay. Once you go back to your itinerary now that we have that context.
Sure. So we flew into Cluj. We took like a Sprinter van for a group of about 10 of us, which fit comfortably into a Sprinter van. And that's a smaller van that allows us to get into smaller places as opposed to some big bus or something. So we're in Budești, which is a really nice sort of small village. There's a lot of rolling hills and agriculture around the area. There's a small little town, many old wooden churches. This area has about 100 wooden churches. I think there's 8 of them that are UNESCO World Heritage Sites.
Okay.
And we visit 2 or 3 of them. So they're from about the 1640s. And it's interesting about these churches in that they were built out of wood because at the time they weren't allowed to build churches out of stone. So no one thought that these churches would last 300-400 years, although they have. So you've got these amazing structures made completely out of wood.
And when you say they weren't allowed to, do you know who wasn't allowing them to build out of stone?
I'm not sure if it was the government or the religious leaders at the time.
Okay.
But yeah, they weren't allowed to build them out of stone, so they built them out of wood, and no one expected them to last 400 years. Some are in very good condition. Of course, many have been restored. But these churches alone are one really great reason to visit this area. They're very tall. The steeples are super tall. The churches themselves are very small. You go inside and there's hand-painted frescoes and just beautiful interiors, very dark. Some of them, the windows have been changed because they pointed out some of the original windows and they're maybe like 6 inches square. Today there's bigger windows that they've incorporated since then. What's funny is the one near Budești that we went to, we had the tour operator, the guide had to call the key holder in advance of our arrival so that she could come from her home and open up the church for us. We had the place to ourselves. There's a wonderful cemetery that surrounds it. So we were able to get inside, photograph outside. But those churches alone are one really great reason to visit the area.
I have an answer to the question that I asked earlier is they are, you didn't mention, but they are Orthodox churches. And it was the Catholic Austro-Hungarian authorities that didn't allow them to build stone Orthodox churches at the time. So that makes a little more sense.
Excellent. Okay. So other reasons to visit are really the people working the land. There's not a lot of mechanical like tractors and things like that. So it's mostly just handwork, people with scythes cutting down the hay, with wooden pitchforks, gathering the hay. Speaking about that, number one, I really didn't know what hay was. I never really thought about it. Right? To me, hay is straw, that you might see in a barn here in the States. But there, what hay is, it's a mixture. There could be 50 different species of flowers, legumes, all grasses, all kinds of stuff. So this land is set aside, and often this land has been in the family for generations. At this time of year, I said there's these 2 windows of time. So in September, on the second harvest, you'll see some fields that still have yet to be harvested. And if you go into them, there's lots of flowers and things. And so they'll cut that down, let it dry. Then typically the women will come in and they cut it down in the morning when it's sort of wet and dewy. Then they'll flip that over maybe middle of the day so that they can dry the lower parts of it. And then they'll put it into a circle sort of around a large, maybe 20-foot tall pole that's stuck into the ground. And then little by little, they'll take that hay and bunch it up against that pole, and someone will get on top of that hay. And as people below are pitchforking it up to this person, they're gathering it towards that pole and stomping it down. And the idea is that this is meant to hold over the animals for the winter. So it's just an interesting tradition that they have, and you'll see people from little children, sort of pretending that they're helping, to older folks in their 70s and 80s it's just something that you do. And I learned that there's this sort of brain drain from the countryside to the big cities like Bucharest. So even children of these families that are living in Bucharest, the big city, will come back at this time of year to help out. You just do that. It's sort of expected. And it's the same with the potato harvest. Quick story, we were at one location. There was this woman. It was just a beautiful day. This older woman, probably in her 80s, was rolling up wool into balls to make sweaters and things. So it just seemed like the perfect job for this lady, sitting in this wonderful gazebo and rolling balls of twine. My guide was talking to her, and she started crying. So I didn't say anything at the time, and later I'm with my guide, and I said, why did that lady start crying? And he said, well, she was upset because she has diabetes, and I saw her legs and her ankles were, sort of deformed, and you could tell that she did have some problems with her feet. And she was so upset that she couldn't be in the fields with the family and that she had to be doing this job, that she started crying. And that's how special it is to them to be a part of that tradition.
Excellent. Where do we go next?
There's another little town called Breb, which is just outside of Budești, and it's just sort of winding lanes. There's a very large church there. It's sort of in a valley. You could see it from a far distance, but it's great to just walk these little 1- and 2-lane roads. There's another wooden church there, little hotel that we stay at. The food in Romania is absolutely phenomenal. The portions are over the top. There's a lot of great soups and stews. So the food, I can't recommend the food highly enough. We also went to a town called Sighetu Marmației. I'm sure I'm butchering that name. This is a much larger town, and it's right on the border of Ukraine. Here, there's a wonderful market that we visited, and I didn't see one other tourist in this area, but walked through, and our group sort of had some free time. Everyone walked around, and me and a couple of the people stopped in on the baker and talked to some different vendors. This one baker that we stopped in was a fairly young woman, maybe 30, 35 years old, and somehow it came out that she spoke Spanish. And I speak Spanish. I don't speak Romanian. So we actually were able to have a real conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And turned out that quite a few Romanians have spent a lot of time in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
I found at least 2 or 3 other people in that town that I was able to have a conversation with by speaking Spanish.
Well, and I'm curious, I know you don't speak Romanian, but Romanian being a Romance language, do you find you can understand some of it, at least in the written form?
Very little.
Okay.
It is considered obviously a Romance language. Once in a while, I heard hints of Italian.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But really not much.
Okay. Oh, well, I mean, it is obviously a derivative of Latin, so that would make sense.
Yeah. Also in Sighetu Marmației, there's a sort of a museum. It's a former prison. It's very interesting to learn about Romania's communist past.
Mm-hmm.
You can walk through this prison and see some very interesting ways that the prisoners lived. There's some great displays there, much of it in Romanian. Another reason to visit that town. Nearby, something that I did on my scouting trip was a town called Sapanta.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's how Sapansa. I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
Right there on the border with Ukraine.
Right. That's a little bit further west. And there, sort of the main draw is these wooden headstones that this particular man carved out of wood. Back when most people didn't read, he would sort of carve out the person's life on a wooden headstone.
Interesting.
And if he was a womanizer, they would show a picture of him with several women. And, it was very comical. Yep.
I suppose the wife does get the last word if the husband dies first,
Yeah, right. If he was a drinker, there'd be all kinds of beer and palinka, which palinka is the local sort of brandy. It's kind of a hooch. And they make it out of pears and apples. You could walk down these roads and you'll see trees, just apple trees and pear trees just dripping with fruit. And I love just picking them right off the tree and eating them right there. There's these particular places now. I don't think that it's actually legal, but there's not really anyone that's getting people that are doing this. But if you've got a lot of apples or pears from your land, you can bring them to this one co-op place where this man will turn it into palinka. Then his payment is a percentage of the result. So he might get 10 or 15% of whatever the output is. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little tradition that they have.
I have been distracted, I'll say, while you've been talking about this, looking at these amazing tombstones that you mentioned, sometimes that are showing how the person died. Mm-hmm. Some macabre, but bizarre and interesting, fascinating.
Yeah, it's a neat place. So from Maramureş, we went over the mountains there and into Bukovina. But along this sort of border between these two regions is an area in the mountains that's well known for harvesting porcini mushrooms.
Okay.
And so the people that typically will do this are the gypsies.
Mm-hmm.
And one misconception that I think a lot of people have is that Romania is made up of gypsies. And it's really just about 3% of the population is gypsy.
Oh, I didn't know it was that small. Okay.
It's very small. Very small. So you don't see a lot of them around. There are some small pockets of them in different areas. But in this region of the mountains, so it's kind of along that border between the these two regions, Maramureş and Bukovina, at this time of year, the gypsies will come and set up temporary camps. And they will be the ones that go out into the forest and pick mushrooms for maybe 3-4 months, whatever the season is. They will gather them, and then someone will come by and purchase them from the gypsies, sort of a wholesaler who will then wholesale them to someone else probably, and then they eventually end up on the tables of some of the finest restaurants in Tuscany and France and probably all over the world.
Interesting.
But these camps are very interesting. So we pulled over this time and on my scouting trip, and we got to meet the people and sort of see how they live. They live in very humble shacks that are made out of wood and plastic, but they're extended families, mostly cousins and second cousins and things. So this particular group that we met on this trip was probably 30 or 40 people of an extended family. But these mushrooms are just outstanding, and you'll see them certainly on plates there in Romania. But I just thought that this was a neat thing for the gypsies that will do this and set up these temporary camps.
And by gypsies, we mean the Romani people. So while you were talking about that, I was looking up, and Romania has the second largest population of Romani by percentage, as you mentioned, second to Bulgaria, which I didn't realize. And then in terms of the top countries, in terms of significant portions of populations, the top country for the Romani, for the gypsy people, is the United States, followed second by Brazil in terms of the diaspora, which both of those countries caught me by surprise.
Yeah, that is surprising. And their origin is from India, which I did not realize either.
Right. Interesting.
So as we left this mountainous region and made our way into Bukovina, so that northeastern part of Romania, which again sort of folds into southern Ukraine and even Moldova. Here, it's a little bit different. We had a chance to meet some wonderful people there. We had a chance to go to this blacksmith's house, to his workshop. And when I was on my scouting trip, he was pounding out horseshoes, and it was two young brothers, probably 19 and 16. And the 19-year-old pounded out 4 horseshoes in about 15 minutes. And he stacked them up next to each other. And he's doing this all by hand, of course. And he stacked them up next to each other, and they were absolutely perfect. I mean, they were all the exact same size. And then this year, when we were planning to go to his same workshop, he had gotten a job to go actually shoe some horses. So he wasn't at the workshop. He was on site at a man's place where he was shoeing the horses. So we got a chance to see that. And that was pretty interesting, too. It's funny, I think I gave you some pictures, and I could just tell that he was really well built, and I found out that he's actually going to college to learn to be a fitness instructor.
I would think blacksmithing would help with that a lot.
Yeah, exactly. So I knew that he had these really strong arms, and so I said, hey, show me your muscles. And so he gave me this big old bicep. I think I gave you a picture of that. But really great people. So what I try to do whenever I'm able to come back to a country, which I do have the luxury of doing often, is bring back pictures from the previous trip. And so I brought him those pictures back, and he was super happy.
Interesting.
I try to do that as much as possible.
Excellent. Where else do we have to go?
Yeah, the town that we stayed at is a town called Vama, which actually means customs house. So years ago, it was an area that they would collect taxes from people passing through this region. And it's just kind of a postcard town. In the morning, there's a beautiful mist that sort of just lays in the valley. There's several churches there. So we got to go out for an early shoot and try to capture that. There's just great little lanes to walk through and photograph and see how people are living. Watch the people harvesting potatoes and just whatever it is that they're doing. We have dinner at a wonderful lady's house. It's almost like a museum. And so we have dinner in this big room that's just got all these artifacts from 200-300 years ago. And she makes this wonderful meal for us. The Palinka is definitely flowing. And so those are the kinds of experiences that I like to incorporate into my trips, where we can actually get into people's houses, see how they live, see how they work. And the Romanian people are just so open to doing that and having visitors. And our guide was telling us that Romania is such a blend of people. First you had the Hungarians and the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans, and they're just used to foreigners. And so the people are very open to having foreigners visit and welcome to being photographed. They're very open to being photographed. typically not looking for any tips or anything. So I'm often asked, did you have to pay for these photographs? And one thing that our guide did for us, he said, you don't have to pay the people. If there's ever a situation where I do feel like we need to give them something, he asked me to bring anything that had American flags on it. It could be pens, or I brought some just toothpicks that had American flags on them. And he said, let me hand out those things, and I'll do it when I feel that it's necessary. The only people that he said on a regular basis will expect to be paid something are the gypsies.
Okay.
So he made it very easy on us. We didn't have to think about it. He just took care of it, which I thought was an excellent service.
Interesting.
The other thing that you'll see a lot of in this region is the whole process of milk. And what I mean by that is, of course, we see the people out there harvesting the hay for the animals. Then you'll see the typically ladies milking the cows. Then there's the man or the woman sitting by the side of the road with their one container of milk, waiting for a man on a horse cart to come by to collect that. Then he'll bring it to a co-op where they will distribute the milk and sell it. And then I'm sure that, the money flows down to the original farmer. To get to see that whole process and how it's done so, what I would call primitively.
I would go with traditionally, but...
Traditionally. Yeah. Seeing those processes like that is just great. And just the reason that I travel.
One thing that occurred to me as I'm looking, at some of the pictures that I was looking at some of the pictures that you sent, and you talked about how the fields, there wasn't a lot of equipment. It's interesting to me, I noticed this in my recent travel too, that even just flying over a country, you can tell whether or not they're mechanized. And the pictures that you sent of the fields from Romania, I'm looking at one from Sadova, for instance, that are these thin strips of fields. They tend to be much longer than they are wide. It's just really characteristic of somebody who is using manual harvesting techniques versus if you've flown over the middle of the United States, for instance, in these very square fields, and the fields are very large, tends to be much more characteristic of somebody who's using automated equipment, who's using tractors and combines and that sort of thing. So even just flying over it, you can easily tell what level of mechanization there is in farming typically.
Right. And the fields and the tracts of lands are much smaller.
Yeah, they just have to be. And we noticed that when we flew into Bosnia recently in Sarajevo. I was surprised how it was quite clearly that most people were using manual harvesting techniques. Interesting.
Yep. I think overall the reasons to visit this area is just to sort of feel like you're stepping back in time a bit, but you still have got the modern day infrastructure that makes it more comfortable for us. So you've really got the best of both worlds.
Now, you sent me one more picture that you haven't talked about, and that's some of the monasteries.
Yeah, the monasteries, the ones that we visited were in the Bukovina area.
Okay.
One was in Sucevica, and Moldovica was the other one. And these are monasteries from the early 1500s. There are frescoes both inside and out.
Yeah, the outside was really surprising.
Yeah, which is unusual. And of course, that goes back to when people were illiterate, and they've got these Bible stories from both the Old and New Testament that they've drawn out and try to tell the stories of the Bible visually so that these people could understand. And then the interiors of these churches are very small, but extremely intricate, lots of detail, and very dark. Difficult to photograph, but well worth visiting.
Yeah, it looks like they would be. They're fascinating to look at.
Yes, fantastic. Absolutely. And these are UNESCO World Heritage Sites as well. And you've got these nuns that are walking around the area. They do not want to be photographed. But there's one picture I made with one of the nuns walking around with this long, what looks like a 2x4. She's got it in one hand. It's probably 8 feet long, and it's over one shoulder, and then she's got a wooden mallet in the other hand, and she will bang on it, and that's sort of a call to prayer.
So it's like a bell.
It is.
Other churches. Interesting.
Yeah, so that's a really neat traditional thing that they still do to this day. And spoke to some of the nuns. Many of them spoke very good English, and some of them fairly young. So it's just neat to be in that environment with them where they live.
And it looked like from the pictures that these were probably Orthodox monasteries.
They are Orthodox, yes.
Okay. Excellent. What surprised you about the area when you first went there?
I guess I keep coming back to how modern the infrastructure was. I expected it to be a lot rougher to get between these areas, and it really wasn't a problem at all. The food surprised me. Just the quantities of food are just incredible.
Well, in an agricultural area, you're used to feeding farmers,
Yeah.
so I wouldn't be surprised. What kind of dishes, for instance, stand out in your memory?
Certainly a lot of mushroom dishes based on the mushrooms, especially at that time of year.
Sure, makes sense.
Lots of stews, really hearty soups, many in bread bowls. Certainly lots of potatoes, but very, very hearty food and good beer.
And good beer, okay. What's one warning you would give about somebody who's going to that area? One thing they should know before they go.
You should drink bottled water.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, yeah, one of the things that, that you talk about that infrastructure is being aware of water. Can people drink the water out of the faucet there? Many of us did, had no problems, but other people did and did have some problems. So very early on, we said, hey, just drink bottled water, which we provided, and it's very available. And so just be aware of the water.
Excellent. All right, as we start to wind this down, before I get to my last 4 questions, what else should we know before we head to this area?
Romania is very accessible. It's flying into Bucharest or even Cluj. You can fly directly into Cluj from Frankfurt and many of the major hubs in Europe. I don't know why, but it just seemed like it was so far away. But it's just very, very accessible. And so you've got this very sort of out-of-the-way place in one sense that's very accessible.
Well, and you say far away. I ought to then ask my typical question, which I didn't ask you. When did it seem very familiar, and when did it seem very unfamiliar, very remote?
Certainly flying into Bucharest, which is a big city. It's called the Little Paris.
Sure.
But then even flying into Cluj, Cluj is a fairly good-sized town. I did spend some time there on my scouting trip, decided that it wasn't something we needed to include on the actual trip. That was very familiar, some really nice little old towns and great restaurants and things. So that to me was familiar, especially having spent a lot of time in Europe. When I felt the most unfamiliar was going into these regions where I'm seeing the people working in these very traditional farming ways. Pulling over to the side of the road, we'd see some people harvesting the hay, cutting it down. We'd pull over and start talking to them. Many, if not all, were open to our photographing them. And just smiley, happy people. I mentioned that you see little kids to older folks, even pregnant ladies out there. So there was this couple, man and his pregnant wife. And I made a comment to my guide. I said, boy, you'd never see a pregnant woman working the farm in the U.S. these days. And he says, well, you guys, people go to the Lamaze class and do all these other exercises and yoga, and here they harvest hay. I said, okay, that makes sense.
Well, I'm pretty sure that some of our grandmothers are probably out there on the farm still working I think my grandmother's mother had 16 kids, so she was pretty much always pregnant as far as I could figure out.
Well, that's what I mean. It's like, being back 5 or 100 years, but it's today.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The most beautiful spot you were, where were you?
The place that really just stands out is that area near Budapest and Maramureş. These beautiful fields of haystacks and the mountains in the distance, the morning mist, green fields, brown haystacks. To me, that just sums it up.
Okay. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in this region in Romania.
I mentioned the palinka earlier, and boy, they enjoy their palinka. That's something that you'll see at all hours of the day. It's one of those things that everyone's offered whenever you come to someone's house. You're offered the palinka. There's a nondescript bottle sitting there and a bunch of little tiny shot glasses, and everyone gets one. So to me, that was great.
So palinka, it's not just for breakfast anymore?
Exactly. And back in Maramureş, it reminds me of this man. I talked about this, the people there who sort of everyone brings their fruits to them, and then this man will make the palinka for you for a percentage. They've got this hat that's called a clope, C-L-O-P-E, and it's a really interesting looking hat. It's very tiny. kind of sits on the top of the man's skull, and then it's got a very colorful, ornate ribbon that goes down the back of it that I think I sent you some pictures of. And you'll see the men in that region wearing that all the time. Many of them you could tell, are very old and well worn. The hats, that is.
Possibly true of the men as well. But
yeah, exactly. But what reminded me is that this man was always wearing the klop hat.
And finish the sentence. You really know you're in Romania, specifically in, and what are the two names of the areas again?
Maramureş
and
Bukovina.
And Bukovina. When what?
When you're driving down the road, and on either side there are rolling hills with beautiful haystacks and meticulously maintained fields that have just recently been cut down, and now they're formed into these haystacks that are drying. And maybe you pull over to the side of the road and start talking to these people, and they're just so open, very few of which speak English. So it was great to have our local guide and tour operator along to translate, but very open to telling us and answering any questions that we had. Just beautiful people.
Okay. And if you had to summarize the region in 3 words?
A living museum.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Ralph, I started to introduce you the first time around as being from ralphvelasco.com. That is not the name of your website anymore, but it used to be when you were on here last time. Where can people read more about your travels and maybe even sign up for one of your tours?
Sure. If you go to photoenrichment.com, people can look there, and you look for tours, and there's a little drop down. You'll see all the trips I have coming up. The website is being updated over the next couple months, so it might look different the next time you come back. But there's all kinds of great trips that I have coming up. And Romania, we're doing again next year, those same 2 weeks, first 2 weeks of September.
Excellent. And certainly if you go to Ralph's site, let him know that you heard about him on Amateur Traveler. Ralph, thanks so much for coming and sharing your newfound love for Northern Romania.
Very good. Thank you so much.
In news of the community, we have the final details, including the price for next year's trip to Cambodia, which will start April 1st of 2016, and the ground transportation will cost $775, airfare not included. Go to amateurtraveler.com/trips to see the detail. That is a private Facebook group, and you will have to get permission to join. Got an email recently from Paulo who said, I found your podcast a couple of months ago, and I've been listening to all Australia-related episodes as I'm preparing a month-long trip to the land down under next summer. And I'm writing just to let you know that it's been quite helpful for my travel planning. Also, some episodes make me wish I had more time to get to visit places like Canberra and the Coral Coast. I've also listened to some episodes about Brazil. That's where I'm from. It's always fun to see my country under a foreigner's perspective. Hope one day you can make a trip to Brazil and get to know some beautiful places of our big country. Thanks for the best travel podcast I've listened to. I'll keep listening to the new episodes, hoping to get to know a lot more about the world. Paulo. Paulo, I agree with you. I definitely want to get to Brazil sometime. Not sure when it's going to happen. I only got to South America for the first time this year. So there's a lot of places in the world I have not been, although I just recently traveled to my 11th new country this year. So it's not that I'm not trying. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. Again, remember the trip to Cambodia. If that is one of the places you haven't been, you can come with us. If you have questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, as Paulo did, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. You can follow me on Twitter, Pinterest, or Instagram at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.